Recording in progress.
So welcome everybody. We are going to shut this door. So thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. My name is Emily Hubner. I'm the Assistant Director of the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area. We are the Maryland State Certified Heritage Area for Carroll, Frederick, and Washington counties. As you can see, we have a group gathered here in the conference room here in our offices in Federated Charities. And we also have an audience online of local historic sites, museums, nonprofits, and we also have attendees from across Maryland and beyond. Thank you everybody for joining us today. So again, we'll be recording this presentation and Q&A. Please do your best to keep microphones muted. I'm going to be keeping an eye out as well during the presentation. This is our first hybrid presentation with the in-person and virtual audiences, so we will be doing our best to keep things moving smoothly. And thank you for your help and perhaps your patience as we learn today. Today's presentation is about Reframing History, which is a new initiative from the American Association for State and Local History. I'm about to admit people from the waiting room. And so amid national controversy, it is more important than ever for the history community to be able to clearly explain what history is, how we come to understand the past, and why it matters to society. This initiative offers a new way to understand how Americans think about history and how our field can more effectively explain history's value. There will be time after our speaker's presentation for questions. Today's speaker is John Marks. John is the director of the Public History Research Lab at the American Association for State and Local History. He leads research on major challenges facing the nation's history and museum community and works to connect emerging research with professional practice. He holds a Ph.D. in history from Rice University. John, I'll go ahead and toss it to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to all of you who are there in person. Thank you to everyone who's joining us virtually. I'm very happy to get to share some of these ideas with you and hear from you all about what you think of them, how you think they might influence your work, and what AASLH can do to help continue to connect this research with emerging practice at history organizations around the country. Like Emily said, my name is John Marks, and I'm the director of the Public History Research Lab at AASLH. The Public History Research Lab was something we started about a year ago to kind of serve as the central hub for our projects on our research projects related to public history. So each year we do a national visitation report to assess visitation at history organizations. We just completed a major census of history organizations in the US, but probably the biggest project we've done so far is the Reframing History project that I'm going to talk about today. Just in case some of you aren't familiar with AASLH, the American Association for State and Local History is a national membership association serving the public history community, so serving institutions of all types and all sizes, particularly small organizations, history museums, historical societies, and historic sites mainly, as well as the practitioners and volunteers and professionals who work at those places. We provide research and advocacy on behalf of the field, and also provide professional development in the form of webinars and workshops and publications and an annual conference that is both now in person and online. So if you haven't heard of us, please check out some of the things that we have to offer. But I'm going to start today, since I will be talking for a while, we'll start today actually with a video that we produced to kind of provide an overview of the Reframing History project. It would I'm not sure how many of you have familiarity with the project already. If folks who have joined us virtually want to introduce themselves in the chat, it would help to see what kind of institutions people are coming from. But hopefully this video, it's about 5 minutes, will provide an overview from some of the researchers and from some national museum and historic site leaders about what the project is and what we hope it will accomplish.
I've been working in and with history organizations for 30 years, and the question of why history matters and how to convey that has always been the key question. We're all ultimately trying to get our audiences to engage with history, to feel that they're a part of it, feel that their stories matter, and that this whole endeavor of holding on to history and preserving it and ultimately interpreting it for new audiences means something and is going somewhere, and this report does a great job of showing that it can lead society toward a more just place.
People have a lot of suspicions about historians and about their interpretations, and they tend to assume that any sort of interpretation is subjective and biased. These framing strategies are ways of helping historians to get past those unproductive ways of thinking and build on the more productive ways of thinking that we saw.
I think now we have this framework and a toolkit that we can share with the staff and the educators that work on these programs every day, and that's going to be a great resource.
What we're finding is that people really assume that there is one objective truth about the past that is out there and is waiting to be found, and that it's very easy to find and determine. It really makes it difficult for people to understand what historical interpretation involves and what the process is that historians are using to develop their findings and reach a historical consensus.
Just think about the ways in which history is animated. History has its eyes on you, history is watching. History doesn't do anything. Historians do. Thinkers do, teachers do, archivists do. We are the ones who engage with the past, who put the clues and the pieces together to understand in an ever-shifting landscape of knowledge what has happened, so that then we can turn that into a tool of utility.
Advancing history is not just accepting history that was written 50 or 100 years ago, it's constantly questioning what new way of looking at it will help us really understand the history of my community or the history of my country.
What we're talking about is kind of certain pathways that can get us out of those weeds of these polarized debates. A metaphor of the process of historical interpretation is like doing detective work. It's a chance to showcase the process of doing history. Academic historians, public historians, people working in museums and historical sites, everyone in that broader field, what they're doing and how that's important.
I really do like the idea of the detective metaphor, that disbands this binary, like it's just this thought and this thought, which almost always is going to be diametrically opposed to each other. But now, if we're starting to unpack it and we have a third thought, a fourth thought, and before you know it, 10 thoughts, now we're not looking at a binary anymore, we're looking at a spectrum. And that's where I believe we can try to find true consensus.
It's really about questioning and opening up that dialogue, having honest conversations, questioning who told this story, why is this story being told this way? How do we gather all these facts and evidence? How do they make sense, right? How do you put them all together and create that new narrative? And that's going to be exciting.
People have an understanding of history as learning from past mistakes. That value of progress builds on that thinking, but it makes it, more specific by pairing it with justice, saying this isn't just about progress for progress's sake. We also have to address past injustices.
People care deeply about those stories when they connect them to other people, when they connect them to their own lives and their lived experiences.
I know many history museums have a long-standing permanent exhibit on display, right? They need to make changes, they need to evolve into a different narrative, bring in some new labels, bring in some new language.
And so what we're trying to do now is take this opportunity to convert those nervous landscapes into places of belonging by being honest about the history, being pluralistic about the history, and also offering an opportunity for people to engage in their authentic selves in this space without shame or guilt.
I like to think of democracy and history as verbs, right? They should be animated and active and alive. And the report lays out a blueprint for us to expand the power of our own engagement to then ignite civic engagement.
We came up with this report, and it would definitely have been useful before all of these national debates kind of broke to the surface. And now that they have, it's really going to be a set of unifying principles, I think, that history practitioners and history teachers and people who care about history and history organizations can all rally around and use.
Many people have stepped up and said, I want to make some changes. I don't think that's my story being told in that museum, for instance. I want to see my story being told in those walls, and how do we do that? And I think if museums and organizations use this as an opportunity to take a step back and say, let's do something about it. Let's make sure those stories are being collected and those voices are being heard. we'll be that much closer to a more perfect union.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed that at least a little bit. I wanted to make sure that you weren't just hearing about this project from me, but that you had a chance to hear from some other folks in the field about what this project is and why it might be useful for you at your institutions. Certainly, since we started this project about 3 years ago now, the national conversation around history has changed considerably, has grown more fraught. These conversations have become more difficult, but we think that the toolkit that we're providing through Reframing History can really offer a way for history organizations to lead more productive conversations about history with your audiences, with members of your community, with people of all kinds. And so I'm looking forward to getting a chance to speak about it with you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick again to give you a quick overview of the project and what we found and some of the recommendations we're making. And then hopefully we'll have a chance at the end to talk a little bit about what your questions are, other ideas for how you might see this impacting the work that you're doing at your institutions. So this is a project that was funded by the Mellon Foundation, and it was carried out as a pretty broad partnership. So on the history practitioner side, it was a partnership between AASLH, the National Council on Public History, and the Organization of American Historians. And we really wanted to make sure that we had a broad representation of the history community, both academics and public history practitioners, museum folks. And then on the research side, we partnered with the Frameworks Institute, who is a research organization, nonprofit that works with issue advocacy groups, works with interest groups to help reframe the public conversation around key social issues, in this case, around history. And so what we wanted to do in entering into this project was to really try to reframe the conversation around history and the value of history in society. Apologies, I live across the street from a firehouse. You can hear that in the background. And so what we wanted to accomplish by doing that reframing was to try to establish a more effective and cohesive message across our field. History organizations are incredibly diverse in their size, in their missions, in the types of audiences they serve, but we wanted to provide tools that would help all of these different kinds of organizations speak with a shared language to try to strengthen the collective impact of our work. And so really what we wanted to try to do at the core of this project was to identify how the public thinks about history and what is the best way to explain what history is and why it's valuable to society. And so how people think about history is different from what people think about history. This wasn't like public opinion research. It was more trying to get at the habits of mind that people employ, how they think about questions related to history. And then we wanted to understand, as an empirical question, are the ways that we describe history actually helping people understand it better or not? Which seems like a very basic question, but it's one that hadn't really been taken on before, at least not in a way that could lead to kind of actionable recommendations. So the basis of the project, the foundational kind of problem of this project and a lot of work that the Frameworks Institute does is what our research colleagues called a you say, they think problem. So we as a professional community, as the public history field and museum field are saying one thing, the public is hearing that thing, but they're thinking another. And so we're often using the same terminology, but we're talking past one another, which is not a recipe for a productive conversation. So in this case, we're all saying history, right? We as practitioners are saying history, members of the public, our visitors are saying history, but we often mean very different things. And this is something that our research helped reveal and put some additional detail to. So when we all say history, we mean something along the lines of this ongoing process of describing, analyzing, evaluating, and interpreting past events, something that's continually revisited as new evidence comes to light. Members of the public, meanwhile, by and large, when they hear history, they're thinking something that is about recording and documenting just the facts. So we're all saying history to one another, but we're kind of like ships passing in the night here. We're not connecting on the core of what this actually is, and that's really preventing us from having productive conversations about the past. And so how do you solve a you say, they think problem? Well, we did it in 3 phases with our colleagues at the Frameworks Institute. So the first phase was to really try to understand where those gaps in understanding were between the field and the public. And to do that, we did a range of different research approaches, but we tried to identify cultural models that members of the public are using. So when we say cultural models, we mean what assumptions and beliefs about history are shared widely across American society, what these kinds of ideas that are largely automatic that people rely on to make meaning of the world. So this is kind of the core of what we mean when we say how, not what people think about history. The second phase of the project, once we understood where those gaps in understanding were, was to design and test strategies that could bridge those gaps. Most research tends to stop at phase 1, right? It tends to identify a problem and to help better explicate where it is. But this project goes 2 steps further. So the first step further is to really try to design and test strategies that can bridge those gaps. And to do that, we used what we call frames. So these are sets of choices about what kind of information to present, how to present that information, what to emphasize, how to explain things, what metaphors to use, often what to leave unsaid in order to make sure that our conversations about history can kind of remain on the tracks, right? There are lots and lots of plausibly useful ways that you can explain history to someone, but with something as complicated as history that's so deeply embedded with people's sense of themselves and their communities and ideas about politics and race and all sorts of other things, even the most kind of plausibly useful strategy can very quickly go off the rails. And so we wanted to not only design these recommendations, but to really rigorously test them to make sure that they worked to help people understand what history is a little bit better. And then the third phase of the project, which is where we are right now, both literally for this conversation and kind of more generally in AASLH's work, is to build support for these strategies so that practitioners in the field can help move them forward. We're doing that through webinars, through presentations like this one, and through, we did a podcast, we've developed some videos, a range of other activities. So I'll kind of go over very briefly what we found for our history communications challenges, this first phase of the project. If you go to the resources page on aaslh.org/reframing history, you can find our full phase 1 report that goes into these findings in a lot more detail. But basically our findings about the gaps in understanding about history and its value between the field and the public came down to a few key things. And they're a little bit discouraging considering they don't seem all that strange to us. Most of us should be familiar with these things, but they're still really prevalent out there. So the first is that the public assumes history is about finding a single objective truth about the past. Members of the public believe that it's the job of history professionals, curators, historians, scholars, writers to go and find this piece of truth from the past and to mine it from the past and bring it back to the present, and that's a relatively straightforward process. And so their sort of model of comparison for what historians and history professionals do is they think of historians as journalists of the past, right? That it is our job as history professionals to go to the past, report on just the facts, and bring those back and report them in the present. And so along with these two, members of the public tend to see interpretation, things that we think of as very standard in the field and part of our professional practice, they view those as illegitimate, right? That our interpretation of history, something that goes beyond names and dates, is viewed as a sign that we're introducing political bias into a conversation. And so this is why so often our conversations about history are unproductive, because it's one person's truth against another person's truth, or they think that as messengers we're not particularly trustworthy because we're introducing this kind of interpretation into our conversations about the past. So in order to get around these communications gaps, we developed a series of candidate frames, right? Frames that we thought might work for explaining what history is and why it's valuable to society. So these included things like values to emphasize about why history is important to society, different metaphors for explaining the process of doing history. And we developed these frames in conversations with our advisory committee and members of AASLH. And then we spent about a year and a half testing them to see which ones worked and to really make sure that they worked in a wide range of contexts. So we use both qualitative and quantitative methods to test these recommendations. And that included one-on-one interviews with members of the public, which happened like this on Zoom because they were happening mostly in 2020. We also conducted a nationally representative survey experiment with more than 5,000 respondents to get a much broader view of the public view about history, even if it wasn't as deep as some of the qualitative work. And then finally, we conducted what we call peer discourse sessions, which were essentially focus groups to test these recommendations one final time. We really wanted to make sure not just that a recommendation could help people understand history in a one-on-one conversation, but that it could stand up to scrutiny to kind of stress test it in a focus group format where it's being kind of passed around between different people to make sure that it could hold up in public discourse. So we started with lots of frames at the beginning and slowly narrowed down our list to ones that were the most effective and that could stand up to scrutiny through our survey experiment and our focus groups. And so we, back in February, published our report on our findings from this project, and our overall takeaway from this, and what I'm going to spend the rest of my time kind of talking about here, is that in order to have a more productive conversation about history, we have to shift our conversations away from being about this abstract notion of a single historical truth. And instead, we as history professionals really need to emphasize the importance of critical engagement with the past. And we can do that through 4 specific recommendations. So the first is to talk about critical thinking to shift people's perceptions about what history actually involves. The second is to compare historical interpretation to detective work to deepen understanding of historical practice. The third is to emphasize how history helps us make progress towards justice as a society in order to increase people's recognition of history's importance. And the final one is to use concrete, location-specific, and solutions-focused examples to build stronger support for inclusive history. So I'm going to go into each of these in a little bit more depth. So the first is to talk about critical thinking to shift perceptions about what history involves. So in our conversations about why history matters to society, we can emphasize, and what history involves, we can emphasize the role of critical thinking. We can explain to people that practicing history requires critical thinking skills to evaluate different kinds of sources, different perspectives on the past, to take these different pieces of evidence and help them make sense together. And that learning history and engaging with history help people develop these critical thinking skills that they can use in other parts of their life. And using this critical thinking frame had a couple of big effects. So using critical thinking as a way to explain what history involves really helps people better understand the importance of learning history. It also helped generate greater public support for devoting resources to the history field. So when we presented people with this critical thinking frame as opposed to other frames, it did a better job of getting people to support things like public funding for history museums. And so that was a really powerful effect that we saw in using this critical thinking frame. And I think it's really important to emphasize this part of the research that the critical thinking frame, I think it's one that a lot of us are familiar with and have used at one point or another. But we tested it against 2 others that I think people are using a lot right now. And I think it's important to note that critical thinking did more to shift people's understanding of history's nature and value than these other ones. So critical thinking did better than explaining that learning history helps reduce prejudice in society, and it helped people understand history more than emphasizing that learning history helps create a stronger democracy. Those are 2 that I've used personally. I've seen a lot of institutions use, but we found that the kind of broad nature of the critical thinking frame, that it can help people think for themselves, help people evaluate evidence, really helps people understand why it's important to learn history, and in turn, why history museums and historical societies and historic sites are important and matter to society. Our second recommendation is to compare historical interpretation to detective work to deepen understanding of historical practice. So we as practitioners can emphasize that historical interpretation, like detective work, is this ongoing process that requires updating based on the latest evidence. And I think this one is really valuable right now because so often when it comes to particularly introducing more inclusive narratives, introducing new ways of thinking about a topic that people feel like they already know, perhaps especially around the Civil War, it's easy to be accused of revisionist history, right? And that is hard to counter when people are thinking of you and your role as being like a journalist, that you're going back and revising a story that you already wrote. But it's easier to explain to people when you say that the process of doing history is like doing detective work. It helps people build a more accurate understanding of what our process of interpretation actually looks like. It helps people see why it matters to move beyond this facts and dates interpretation, and really helps people get a sense of the kinds of sources that history professionals use, the different kinds of methods that history professionals use to learn about the past, and crucially, the need to revise our understanding as we learn new things, as we encounter new pieces of evidence, or as we ask new questions about existing pieces of evidence. And so we compared this detective metaphor because it's one that's, I think, pretty common in the field. We compared it to a lot of other different kinds of metaphors, right? New ones that we invented, other ones we've seen in the field. So we compared the detective metaphor. We also looked at comparing history to history is like drawing a map, or history is like developing medical knowledge, or the process of history is like processing raw materials. It's like a mosaic, or it's like conducting an orchestra. Lots and lots of other examples. And none of them performed as well as the detective one, the detective metaphor. So it's simple and it's elegant and it really helps people understand. And this will be the one place where I quote directly from the report, but I think it's important given the conversations that our field is having around inclusive history. So we found that the detective metaphor builds support for policies that would promote more inclusive, equity-based engagement with history, such as including more diverse accounts of the past from BIPOC and women in history textbooks, and establishing a government commission to make sense of and reckon with the country's past injustices. So I think any metaphor that's capable of doing that in our current environment, and this is research that we were conducting last year, right, I think is something that's worth taking seriously. Our third recommendation, and maybe our most controversial one, or the one that people have tended to be a little bit uncomfortable with, is emphasizing that learning from the past can help move us toward justice. So we found that emphasizing how history helps make progress toward justice really increases people's recognition of history's importance, of why it matters to know history, to learn history, why history institutions doing the work that we do is valuable to society. So it helps build support, emphasize, I guess I should take a step back and say people already have this sense that history is valuable because it helps us learn from past mistakes. But it's really important to help ground that learning in something, right? That it's not just learning for learning's sake, and we're not necessarily doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, which is another thing that people love to just repeat about history when they're thinking about it. But emphasizing that learning from what went right in the past and what went wrong with the past can help us continue to move towards a more just place. And using this, what we call a value frame, this value of justice, really helps build support among members of the public for dedicating new resources, including public funding, government funding, to engage the public in historical learning, like through scholarships for history and through funding for museums. And it really helps orient people towards a more inclusive vision of US history, right? It builds recognition that a broad-based history, one that is honest to the diversity of the American past, and that includes everyone's stories, is something that matters for all of us because it can help build a healthier society, help move society to a more just place. And to head off what is probably the question ringing around for a lot of people, we found as recent as last year that this language of justice still resonates really broadly among the American public, with people of all political leanings, particularly among more conservative members of the American adult population. So while the people aren't necessarily putting the word justice and automatically associating it with social justice, which has a certain political connotation. Justice is something that is still capable of moving the needle with both conservatives and liberals or progressives in American society, which was at the very least encouraging in a time when there's not a whole lot of encouraging political news. And so I found, I think this is really important for people to remember and to think about moving forward in how we describe our work, that you can use the term justice and that people, it will likely resonate with people. But if you think you're communicating with an audience for whom that's not going to work, a particular legislator or a particular school group or whatever the case might be, we also find that it's equally effective to describe what you mean by a more just society. What does that look like in this case, and how is the history you're sharing helping move us there? That's an equally effective tack to take. So our final recommendation, and this is one that I think history institutions, museums, and historic sites can really make some of the most profound contributions to, is to use concrete, location-specific, and solutions-focused examples to build support for inclusive history. So this is one of the graphics that we use to describe the project, but these local examples of inclusive history really help bring these ideas home for people, and they help ward off these more abstract worries about a liberal agenda or about political bias being infused into our interpretations. So describing what you do to do inclusive history at your historic site or at your museum can really show people, can show funders, can help in your advocacy work, can show members of the public what it means to engage with different perspectives or different sources of history, and can help people better understand the value of that approach. So rather than just saying inclusive history is important, or we need more funding to tell more inclusive stories, to tell women's history or to tell African-American history or whatever the case might be, you can draw on examples from your site of, we've started this new program that, tried to share, share the perspective of African-Americans in our community during this time. And it was really successful, and we want to be able to, to expand this to have greater impact. It's much harder for people, and people are much less likely to try to object to something specific like that, because there's broad buy-in that we should be sharing these stories at historic sites. It's when you leave it in abstract terms that you might be less successful. And so you can integrate this recommendation with the other recommendations too, of using examples when you're talking about justice, or using examples when you're talking about the process of detective work. Some final notes here about terminology that came up from our research that I think it's important for people to keep in mind. The first is about the terms diversity and inclusion. Obviously, these are terms that we as a field, as a professional community, are using all the time and are talking about all the time. Excuse me. And when we use them, they carry with them these really deep definitions, right? They're imbued with meaning. We're using these words in a lot of ways as stand-ins for this much broader set of practices and approaches and ways of thinking about the value and the importance of historical work. Most members of the public don't carry those same concepts with them, right? So you can use these terms, and it's again a you say, they think problem. You can use the term inclusive history or inclusion, or you can use the term diversity and think about all these deeper meanings that you attach to it, but they don't necessarily hold that same kind of importance for members of the public. And so rather than using these terms directly in your messaging, if that's what you're trying to do, I think we need to do a better job of explaining their meaning, connecting them to examples, making them real in some way for people, rather than just thinking that the terms are kind of self-explanatory, because they're not. The second, and this continues to evolve, obviously, is about critical race theory, and this was something that we found in the kind of the tail end of our research, is that most people still, and people that come to your historic site or your museum, aren't necessarily engaged with this national debate and this debate that the fields are in about critical race theory, and in fact are still able to think productively about how to learn from inclusive history and how to learn from past injustices. But I think when it does come up in our conversations with visitors or with legislators or with other advocates. I think it's important to move away from this conception that history sites own the truth, that we have the only truth and everyone else is telling lies, even if it's correct and it feels good to say. It's not a productive tack to take in these conversations, right? Because then it's setting up your truth against someone else's truth, and it's not easy to resolve that. It's much easier to resolve differences of opinion and differences in what people know about the past by guiding people towards the need for critical engagement with history, which can help you talk more about examples from the past, can help you talk more about the process of doing history, and can help people see the value of seeing these more inclusive examples, of seeing multiple perspectives on events in the past. And just the final kind of takeaway here, any of these recommendations really work best when we're all speaking with a consistent message. And so I would really encourage all of you to use these recommendations and to use these strategies to frame your conversations around history, and to help people understand the value of your institution in your community and the value of history in society more generally. I hope, one of my hopes for this project specifically is that it's going to give practitioners at museums and historic sites greater confidence to wade into some of these national debates. I think when these debates and conversations about history and inclusive history are happening at the national level, they can be very abstract for people, and people can tend to just kind of side where their political camp is siding. But local institutions have a really unique opportunity here, and in some ways, I think a unique responsibility to bring these conversations to a local level to really help people think through them and work through them. And I hope that these tools in reframing history helps you all as practitioners feel a little bit more confident about convening some of those conversations or writing an opinion essay in your local paper about things that are happening in your state or at the national level. That's really important to everything we do with the research lab, is not just doing research for the sake of research, but doing research that can inform professional practice, that can change and strengthen and help history practitioners, curators, directors, archivists, education folks do their jobs better and have a greater impact. So the report and the toolkit is available now. That went up in February. After that, we did a 6-episode podcast series, which you can find wherever you listen to podcasts, if that's something you do. It's called Reframing History. And we've also done 2 webinars, one on how you can use reframing history for fundraising, another how you can use reframing history in your advocacy work, that are available in the AASLH Resource Center. Later this year or early next year, we're hoping to introduce an online course that can help people really work through some of these ideas and think and practice more deeply how they might use them in their own work. And for more information about all of that, you can visit aaslh.org/reframinghistory. And now, Emily, I don't know if folks are eager to ask questions. The other thing I was going to do, if I had time, was kind of walk through the toolkit a little bit, which is part of this. But I'll pause here, and if folks have questions, we can jump right to it.
Thank you so much, John. I think that we can probably move to the toolkit and then we'll get into questions. That way we're able to, but we'll definitely want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions. Right now we're at 3:40.
Cool, yeah. So you can start thinking about questions that you might have for me, or start dropping them in the chat. But when we developed this project, one thing that we wanted to make sure that we were doing is not just putting out a PDF research report. I am cognizant of the difficulties of getting research to connect with practice through just a PDF research report. Most people that are in public history careers are, at full capacity, oftentimes well beyond capacity, and reading additional reports is not something that people necessarily make time for. And then, in addition, it's hard to make that connection between what the research is saying and how this actually can affect what you're doing in practice. And so one of the things we did was to produce a toolkit that offered some some more actionable ways of kind of digesting this information, right? So this is our Making History Matter toolkit for communicators. And think of all of you attending this as history communicators. And so in the toolkit, we have a couple of different sections, each of which are kind of useful just by themselves. So we have a section on common communication traps and how to avoid them. Hopefully a lot of those will seem familiar to you, but ways that conversations can go on track and how to avoid them. If they do go off track, we also included a bridge and what we call a bridge and pivot guide, which are essentially strategies to get conversations back on track when misperceptions threaten to derail them. We also have some frequently asked questions about framing and the kind of methodological approach that we use to develop these recommendations. And then we have some sample messaging that helps illustrate how to use some of these strategies. So I really think that this can be a useful, if you don't want to read the whole report, or you're still thinking about how to kind of make that jump into affecting something you're actually doing at your institution, I think this toolkit can be really useful. So this is one of our, some of our common communications traps. So things like, talking about historical truth, and it gives an example of how an institution or how a historian might use truth in a conversation, and it suggests sort of what the problem with that way of framing is and an alternative that you might use. And so hopefully some of this stuff looks familiar to folks. I think my favorite piece of the toolkit is this bridge and pivot guide, this guide for keeping conversations on track. Everyone knows when talking with visitors or talking with legislators, talking with family, that when you're talking about history, you're often kind of walking in a minefield, right? That you don't know what kind of audience you're working with or what someone's perceptions about history are, and sometimes it just takes one comment to send things off into a, we'll say, wildly unproductive direction. And so this guide is something that that I'm trying to commit to memory, and I think people can commit to memory because it's fairly straightforward. That is can help bring those conversations back to a productive place. And one of the things we found in our research is that objections to the a kind of professional's conception of what history is and how it's done, certainly objections to inclusive history tend to fall into a few different patterns. So there's this pushback against inclusive history tends to use predictable frames on the part of whoever you're speaking with, right? So people will say historians are biased and just share their this is just your opinion, or history is just the facts and this is revisionist history, or discrimination is a thing of the past, slavery was in the past, we need to just get over it and move past it. And this guide helps connect those objections to inclusive history by providing the frame that you can respond with, right? So if someone says, hey, this is revisionist history, you shouldn't be approaching it this way, that you can respond with the detective work frame, right? And use that in your response. And it also provides some of these really just like very practical bridging strategies, which is to say, ways that you can, other than saying you're wrong, which is not going to be productive for your conversation. It's a way to kind of shift the conversation back to what you want to talk about, which is using these recommendations and using these pattern ways of explaining history. So some of the other, and here's, these are examples of the bridge and pivot guide in action. And then we also have lots of sample reframed messages. And so some of these, I was surprised when I read them because the before sample, seems eminently reasonable and like something that you would see at any museum or historic site. And often these shifts are pretty subtle in how to change our language in order to make it more effective. And so I think seeing some of this can help you rethink how to change your website or change your mission statement or change a paragraph you were writing in an opinion piece or something like that. So I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted this as a resource for you all for making this a little bit more practical and a little bit more actionable when you're thinking about how to reframe your communications at your institution.
Thank you so much, John. I think now we are ready to take some questions, and we got a few questions from folks ahead of time, but first I want to throw it to the people in the room if they have any questions. You get the first crack at asking something. All right, I'm going to dive into some of the questions that we received ahead of time, and let's see. So we received this one question ahead of time is from someone in the city of Taneytown, which is here in northwestern Carroll County. This person's research indicates that the land belonged to the Piscataway people. Do studies show an improved acceptance or engagement with reframed history when BIPOC groups whose history it is are involved in the telling? And are there resources available for engaging with, for instance, the Piscataway Nation and incorporating their voices into our historical interpretation? And the specifics to the Piscataway Nation, that's something that I'd love to talk to this individual about later. But to the rest of the question, what do you think, John?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer to it. But I'll say that our research primarily or exclusively focused on the message and not the messenger. And so I think, and so I don't have data. I don't have anything, particularly empirically grounded that I can say about the difference of using, talking about the value of history for moving society towards justice being explained by a person of color, or an African American history site, or a Native person at a Native history site, versus a different messenger. I think certainly the wider conversation about representation and inclusivity in our field's professional practice, certainly provides other reasons for why why those stories should be told by by people who are hold those identities or are represented by those groups. But that doesn't always need to be the case, and certainly there all of us should be talking about inclusive history and can help people identify with history that isn't their own. And so I think these strategies are also ways to get people, which is often the challenge, I think, to get people to recognize that something that they don't personally identify with is still something important to learn, particularly among white Americans, getting them to see that the history of African Americans or Native people or Asian Americans or Latinos is just as relevant to them and their understanding of American history as the history of white people or of European descended people. And so I think these strategies in some ways can help provide a more effective message when it's not the case that you have someone, someone with that identity that's presenting the information, and potentially can help move the needle for folks who are having a hard time seeing the value of inclusive history.
Thank you. Our next question is, so we've got the US 250th anniversary coming up in 2026. And so do you have advice for organizations that may want to approach reframing history guidance as they forge plans for commemorating that?
I promise I didn't write this question to myself, but it might sound like I did, because these are my two kind of pieces of professional work that I do for AASLH. In addition to the research work, I lead our planning and resources for resource development for planning for the semi-quincentennial for 2026. And so I would highly encourage people to use Reframing History alongside AASLH's Making History at 250 field guide for planning for the semi-quincentennial. Certainly, I think one of our themes that we've talked about is doing history, of using this anniversary as an opportunity to pull back the curtain a little bit farther, to bring people into the process of our work. And the detective metaphor, I think, can provide some a really strong way of doing that and making that clear for people. But then more generally, I think my hope, of AASLH's hope, and something I'm seeing across the field, is that we will use this anniversary as an opportunity to expand who counts as part of American history, right? To expand the story, to tell a more honest version of American history, to share more inclusive narratives. And with that, in our current environment is going to come some pushback. But I think the strategies here can help make clear why it's important to do that. And the 250, I think, can be a really important accelerator for advancing that work. And then our other research and research from other colleagues at other associations shows that there is really broad support across the country for sharing diverse histories, for sharing histories of injustice and violence, for sharing histories that might make people uncomfortable when they learn them. These are things that 60 or 70% of the population really support. And so it is it's a vocal minority that's making an inclusive telling of history controversial and using it as this kind of political wedge issue. But there is a broad base of support for doing inclusive history. And I think the 250th can help us accelerate that. And Reframing History can provide some of the content of how we do that.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Tiffany. Do you have any examples or case studies of small museums embracing these ideas? We have many small all-volunteer museums who are going to be a real push to consider reframing their stories at their sites.
Yeah, that is a great question, Tiffany. And it's something that I think about a lot with all of our research projects, certainly that AASLH thinks about a lot. We serve a very large number of small institutions. We have a small museums committee that we work really closely with to try to make sure that things are appropriately scaled especially for all volunteer museums and historical societies and sites. But the project is still pretty new. It's only been out for a couple of months. So we don't have those kinds of case studies yet, but I hope that we'll be developing them, and through presentations like this one, through some of our other professional development work around reframing history, that we'll start hearing of more sites that have started to integrate this into their work with some success, and we'll be able to share those out. But we know, like, we just completed this census of history organizations in the U.S. And we found that among private nonprofits who you can actually get financial information for, among private nonprofits, 80% of private history nonprofits in the US have annual revenue of less than $200,000 a year. It's like 65% who have, and $200,000 is generally kind of assumed to be the level at which you can afford a full-time professional staff member in addition to your programs. 65% of the nonprofit history organizations in the US have budgets of under $50,000. And I'd venture to guess that a huge chunk of those, you don't have detail below 50,000 for reasons I won't get into, but I'd venture to guess that a huge chunk of those have budgets of under $10,000 a year. And so we're always thinking about ways that we can help, encourage them to use some of these findings and other research. And that's a big focus of our more widely of our professional development efforts.
Thank you. So another question is about avoiding describing history as storytelling, which is mentioned in the toolkit, because storytelling is perceived by some as having inherent bias. Often we train our docents to be storytellers and to make the most of a good emotional hook. In interpretation, there's a trend to elevate storytelling because that's how we receive information really well. Like, there's neuroscience to suggest that. So if we need to avoid the label storytelling, how does that dovetail with the results of the toolkit? And is it meant to cross disciplines within history organizations, or is it primarily for PR, marketing, and development folks? How do we connect those two things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really like this one. Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand the, or it's definitely intended to be work across organizations, right? So that it's not just for communications folks. It's supposed to be for people that are doing interpretation and label writing and writing publications. It's supposed to be useful for people in any role. At most organizations in the country, that role, all those roles are done by the same person, and so it's supposed to be intended to be useful for those folks as well. But to the broader point about how to kind of assess, how to use storytelling I think there's a difference between using storytelling in your interpretation and thinking of yourself and the work that and the way that you're communicating as being as a storyteller. And there's a difference between that and describing history as just a set of stories. Right. And I think that's what we want to avoid, of saying that history is just a set of stories that people have told, because then it sounds like any one story is as good as any other story. And you can just pick the ones that you like or the ones that resonate with you. Right. And what we want people to understand is that there are lots of stories about the past. There are lots of pieces of evidence about the past, but you need critical engagement with those pieces of evidence, critical engagement with those stories to really understand, to really understand what the past was like, to really understand what happened in history, how those developments affected the present. And so I don't think you need to shy away from storytelling as a delivery device, because I think another way of talking about storytelling is to say that these are local examples, right? You're grounding a concept like, you're grounding a concept like the market revolution or the Great Awakening or the Civil War in someone's specific experience that can be grounded in a place. Often, in good storytelling, it's a very specific place, right? Like it is in not just in this region of the country, it's in this room of this house, of this place, of this region of the country, right? That you're really setting a scene. And so I think that is, that kind of good storytelling doesn't conflict, I think, with the recommendations, because I think those are good local examples. I think the real danger is describing to visitors history as just being a set of stories rather than something that needs to be engaged with critically.
Thank you. I think as we approach 4 o'clock, I can get to one of the first questions that was asked, which is, do small museums need to be a member of your organization to benefit from this information? Is there a fee to access it? Can they contact anybody directly for further information? Where should they go to look for that?
Yeah, absolutely. Very much appreciate the question. So we have lots of resources that are available for free on our website that you can find, including the ones from this project. But we do offer, we are a membership association and appreciate and offer some valuable resources for our members. We do have a membership fee, which I believe is $98 for the smallest institutions. We had changed our institutional memberships a few years ago so that the smallest institutions would have the lowest fees rather than just have a set basic institutional membership. So you can find all of that at AASLH.org under the membership tab, or you can email membership@AASLH.org, and I'll type that in the chat and ask them your membership questions. They'd be happy to get back to you.
Thank you. And I will add that we'll be including links to everything that we discussed today into the website in our follow-up to this conversation. I saw that someone had an issue with the download earlier, and they'll be able to access that through a separate link that we're going to be sending along too, so that you can explore these resources more on your own. So I want to thank you, John, for your time today. And so thank you everybody for tuning in and for bearing with us. I think it really went smoothly today. And if you have any further questions, you can get in touch with me and we can see about passing any questions along, John, potentially. And thank you everybody for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me. I'm appreciative of the opportunity. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
All right, I think we'll wrap it up. Bye. Thanks, everybody.